I never stopped to figure that out. Man, a father-in-law's brother. No, you're my brother, my son's brother-in-law. So someone go on Google and figure that out for me before the end of the time. That'd be really helpful. And Kate, what a terrible, wonderful story. And aren't a lot of our stories that way? It's kind of funny how that works. Terrible and wonderful aren't nearly as far apart as they feel when you're in the middle of the terrible, right? And God has an uncanny way of bringing just wonderful things out of some of these terrible moments. Now, I'm hoping that you aren't necessarily in the midst of that just because it's well nigh into finals week and mean professors are giving you vast quantities of work to do. But it does happen at this time of year, I know, and I appreciate you being here. And my hope is that you're all here. Because I know that's a big problem for me at times like this. And I'm kind of at a time like this. I know that sounds stupid. Obviously, I'm at a time like this because I'm here, right? But this whole, what is it like at finals week? Everything begins to pile up. Well, I feel like I've had finals week all semester. This has just been one of those little moments in my life. And I come, therefore, it isn't, just chapel things. I go to church, I go to things like that, and it's like my mind is just going through this 10,000 item to-do list. And I have a really hard time being where I am. So my prayer for all of you and my prayer for me right now is that we can just be here. God has called us to be here at this moment. So you know what? Let's make the most of it. Let's tune in to the Spirit. Let's tune out of Facebook or finals or whatever else that may be in the back or the front of your mind as you walked in the door. And let's just be all here and let the Spirit speak to us and do the things in our hearts and lives that He would want to do. Now, the topic that I'm talking about is kind of an interesting one. And this wasn't really my idea. This came from the After Dark team, but they were talking about the idea that, it seems like we like to talk about Jesus being our healer, our redeemer, our savior. And you go right down all of the list of things that Jesus does for us. And they said, we don't often talk about what we're supposed to be for him. We don't always talk about Jesus being our master. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought, wow, American culture just doesn't really do master, does it? I mean, if you hear someone talking about master and applying it to a human being, in all likelihood what they're doing is saying the human being has mastered some skill. So you can master the piano, but you would never say you've mastered the pianist, right? You don't get to master a person. There's just something wrong about that. And I think the reason for that probably is relatively obvious, but hey, I'm a professor, we like to talk about obvious things. But I think the idea here is if you have a master, that means the other person is what? Yeah, and is slave good? No. It means someone is being oppressed, someone is underneath you, someone's being commanded, and all of these things seem wrong. And, particularly in America, when we think about this, we tend to think about slavery in America, and that's just one of these scars on our culture. That it may have been 150 years ago we fought the Civil War, but it feels like we're still bleeding, right? And so we think of this and we just distance ourselves from slavery. And the fact that we feel that way about the idea of a master and the attendant concept of slave is a thing that I think we generally feel good about relative to our culture. That we don't do things like that. And here's what I'd like to do with that tonight, is just leave that thought intact. I don't want to refute that. I don't even really want to say anything about that, except this. What do you do with a passage like John 13:13 that says, let me read it. You call me Master and Lord, and you say well, for so I am. Wow. You call me Master and Lord, and you know what? Right on, for so I am. Did Jesus, I thought Jesus was supposed to be kind of warm and cuddly. Where the heck is this coming from? And I look at that and I go, what do we make of the fact that Jesus calls himself master, and let me just say it, master over us? What do we do with a whole genre of gospel literature, the master servant, no, let me say it, the master slave parables that seem to be showing up in the Gospels every time you flip a page? What do we do with the fact that probably one of the most common titles we use for Jesus actually means master, the word Lord, right? And all I want to do is make a simple observation with this. There are things about our culture that make it very difficult to operate well within this aspect of Christian discipleship, because we cannot conceive of anyone properly being a master. Not only over us, but over anyone else. But here's the problem. Jesus says, you call me Master and Lord, and you speak well, for so I am. And so what I'd like to do tonight is just to talk a little bit about what it means for Jesus to be our master. Whether it's uncomfortable or not, and trust me on this one, I am not speaking about this because I wake up in the morning saying, hey, let me talk about my favorite thing, Jesus is my master. I got to sign this by these guys. I don't know where they came up with this thing. But I started thinking about it, and I thought, this is actually kind of a painfully relevant issue for me. I don't like the master thing much more than anybody else. And the bottom line is, Jesus still says what he says to me too. And so it's gotten me thinking about this, and what I've in effect discovered is this is just not a big, good, hot area in my life. Needs a little bit of work. So this is one of those times that I'm not really sharing out of my vast reservoir of wisdom, but my experience of not even so much failure as bristling under certain words that Jesus himself has said to us. So let me just begin by reading one of many, way too many passages I could have chosen beyond just the one that we kind of launched on here, where Jesus is saying, yeah, right, I am master. He goes on to spell it out in case you didn't get it. So Luke 17, verse 7, here's what he says. Will any one of you who has a servant, i.e. slave, the word means bond slave in this passage, plowing or keeping sheep, say to him when he has come in from the field, come at once and recline with me? Will he not rather say, prepare supper for me, dress properly, and serve me while I eat and drink? And afterwards, you can eat and drink. Does he thank the servant because he did what he was commanded? So you also, when you've done all that you were commanded, will say, we are unworthy servants. We've only done what is our duty. Man. Sometimes to break out the highlighter, this is one where you get the black Sharpie, just cross it out. You know what it reminds me of? I was reading, you guys probably don't remember this person, but Bum Phillips was a famous football coach for the Houston Oilers back when the Houstons were Oilers. And he is, I think, actually a Hall of Fame football coach, but he passed away recently. And so all these Bum Phillips stories kind of work their way to the surface because people talk about him. And I heard one that reminded me a little bit of this passage. He's kind of a big family guy, interesting character actually, fairly devout, religious, and family man, loved animals and all this kind of stuff. And they told a story that kind of put the animal and the family together. When he had teenage kids, he came home one day from work, decided to take them out to the park and play football. So the kids in the neighborhood all go out with him. They're all playing football. He brings a dog along out there. And of course, if you've ever played football with a dog, it doesn't really work so well. So Bum Phillips turns to the dog and he says, sit. And the dog sits down, and then they go on and they play their football game. Got a couple hours of football in. They're all done. They head back to the house to have dinner. And they're sitting there at the dinner table, and somebody says, "Where's the dog?" "I don't know. Is he in the backyard?" "No." "Did somebody feed him?" "No." They start looking around, and then they run back to the park, and the dog is sitting. "He told me to sit, and I'm going to sit till he tells me to go." So cute. Are you kidding me? What's that dog thinking, man? Get going. Don't let that guy tell you what to do. Yeah. Wow. So if you're wondering why I have a bad attitude towards Master, I can't even picture my dog obeying me that way, right? So after a certain amount of meditation on this, I realized there's something wrong with me. I just don't get the master gig. So let me walk through it and just kind of unpack 3 or 4 things about Jesus being a master. And like I say, I'm not telling you, hey, this is a great one. I'm just telling you what's there. And these are the kind of things that you might expect with him being a master, and that you might not actually like that much about him being a master. And then I'll take some time to talk about some unexpected things about Jesus being master, because that's one of the interesting twists with this story, is that there's a part of Jesus that's very expected and another part of him that's very unexpected. And then I want to think just a little bit about what that means for kind of our ordinary daily life. So let me unpack a few things just in this little passage that I read about what it means for Jesus to be our master. And the first thing is exactly what I just mentioned with the story about the dog. He's our commander. That's what happens in this parable, this story. It isn't even a parable, right? It's just an analogy. I mean, we read this, and this is one of those moments you kind of think, maybe in the Greek it sounds better. Maybe like bond slave in the Greek really just means youth intern. And, I pretty much looked through all my Greek and didn't find that. Like the terms that are associated with this, it isn't just bond. It's like the master word, one of the words that goes with that is despotos, the word from which we get despot, tyrant, those kinds of words. Greek did not help me. And then you think, well, yeah, so drop Greek. There's still time. We can withdraw. No, I'm not recommending that. Second thing that I thought was, well, maybe this is one of those parable things where we say don't get wrapped up in the details of the parable, right? Because parables kind of have one main point, so you don't go freaking out about all the details about how many hours the different people in the vineyard worked, right? There's like one point they're telling you. You know what the problem with this is? The one point is that he's your master, and you're a slave. Okay. And so I was just sitting there with that kind of brutal fact and thinking, okay, then, so what does it mean for him to be my commander in that sense? And let me just observe some of the things that happen in this parable. First of all, it means his commands come first. His commands are first things to us. We do those whether we want to do them or not. We do them whether we feel like doing them or not. Because they're his commands, they come first. If you want this spelled out, take a look at Luke 9, a great passage for this, where all these people say, oh, Jesus, I want to follow you. But first, let me go check out this new piece of land. But first, let me go bury my father. Let me, live with Dad until he passes away. First, let me say goodbye to my family. And everybody says, but first. And Jesus says, if you say but first, there's no place for you in following me, because my commands are first commands. I had spring break 2 weeks ago, right? You did too. I don't know what yours was like, but so like I mentioned, this is like finals week all year for me. So my daughter got married on April 12th. It's great. Yes, thank you. Let me tell you something about marrying off a child. The number of things that you do to make that happen are crazy. And Chris, I mean, my daughter would be the first to agree with me on this, right? I'm not talking out of turn. She's like, yeah, it drives me crazy, the number of things we had to do and all the stuff that went on. So I'm doing that. I'm teaching actually an extra class. And then on top of this, I decided this is high time to do a complete home remodel. And of course, home remodels always cost like 48 times as much as I said it would and take 48 times as long. And my daughter, because she got married in April, wanted to come to California at the end of May to have like the Southern California reception because, you know, she's in Colorado now and all of the, you know, growing up friends are out here. So we have this reception at our house, which is under construction in a grand way. And my one time to work on it, spring break. And I was about 8 days into my spring break, and I realized, I know this sounds bad. I'm just telling you, I realized I had not had a quiet time in 8 days. Because I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and my brain was going wild. I'm wiring, I'm building cabinets, I'm digging ditches, I'm doing sprinklers. I like doing things with my hands, which causes me vast amounts of trouble, because I'm always saying, well, I can do that. After about 10 days of I can do that, I'm about ready to croak. And I realized that my first things have become my last things. I'll get to Jesus when I'm done with my stuff. 8 days in, and it finally dawns on me, Rick, you haven't gotten to Jesus again yet. I'm a Bible professor, for heaven's sake. Man. And there's a part of it that's also my own personality. I do enjoy spending time with Jesus. And I hate it when I'm distracted in that. So I like to kind of clear the decks before I have my time with Jesus. Well, you know what's happened? I'm 56. I think every year I've added another 10 feet to my deck. So now my deck is so darn big, by the time I start, when I get to the other end of it, the back end is dirty, and I'm back at the back end of the deck, clean it up again, and I can go around and around and around, and I will never, ever be done. And I'll never get to Jesus. Stephen Covey tells a great story about first things. And he didn't actually tell the story. He tells it about a speaker that he saw talking about this, but he did an illustration. He got this bucket, and he put a bunch of big rocks in the bucket, and then he goes out to some of the audience and said, okay, is the bucket full? And they look at it and say, yeah, you know, these rocks are brimming. And I say, yes, it's full. And then he takes a bunch of gravel, and he drops it on top of the bucket, and he shakes it down, and all this gravel goes in. Was it full before? And everyone said, no, it wasn't full before. But is it full now? Yes, it's full now. And then he takes a bucket of sand, and he pours the sand into the bucket. And everyone's like, whoa, that was shifty. And he said, so is it full now? And he said, yeah, it's full now. And then he pulls out a bucket of water. And he pours in the water. And then he asks the people, so what do you learn from this illustration? And everyone's like, oh man, you think you can't do anything more, but there's always something more you can do. Yeah. And the guy says, you know what? You're learning the exact wrong lesson. Here's the lesson you should learn from this. If you didn't put the big rocks in first, when would you have ever got them in? The answer's never. First things go in first. And everything else has to go in around it. Now, I don't have any idea what it's like to live that way. I've already told you that. But I'm just telling you, that's what the passage is telling you, okay? First things, his things, they go in first. Why? Because he's the master. And his commands are first things. I would also point out they're last things, in the sense that his words are the final word on this. That is an interesting thing that also bothers me, just as a little side note. He commands, and the expectation here is that the person simply obeys without explanation, and then worst of all, at the end, without thanks, right? Did that not creep you out when I read it? Would you say thank you because they've only done what they're supposed to do? Darn right I'd say thank you. Who raised you anyhow? But it was the final word. This is what I've said. This is what is to be done. Period. We give Peter a hard time a lot because, well, hey, he deserves it a lot of times. You read the Gospels, 90% of the time when you bump into Peter, somehow he's doing something wrong, usually in a big fashion. One great exception to that is exactly on this point. Early on, this is Luke chapter 5, I believe, he's been out fishing all night. And, and by the way, who is the professional fisherman in the Gospels? Peter, right? Is Jesus a professional fisherman? He's a carpenter. Remember that. That's important in the story I'm about to tell you. So he comes back in after this whole day of fishing, and Jesus says, hey, Pete, how about this? How about if you go throw your nets out again? And Peter's like, carpenter, dude. Are you kidding me? I've been out there all night. But then here's what he says. But nonetheless, Lord, at your word, I will throw out my nets. Wow. At your word. I wouldn't mind an explanation. A few words of thanks would be okay, but the bottom line is, Lord, at your word, I will cast out my nets. And of course, he gets such a huge load that he's got to call in his partners, and even after they fill up their partners' boats, they're all about to sink and drown. Wow. His words, first words, his words, last words. Another thing it means for him to be our master. And this comes up actually a lot in the Gospels. And that is, he is also our judge. One of the functions of a master is to be the judge of the servants. Back to the point I made earlier about this whole genre of master-servant parables. How does the story go? Roughly speaking, it's always the same. Basically, what happens is the master says, hey, let me give you 10 talents, and I'm coming back. And what happens when he comes back? You tell me, what did you do with those 10 talents, and then what do? I judge you. Did he really say that? I judge you. Jesus judges us based on what he has given us and the freedom he has given us to use the gifts he's entrusted to us in a manner that we see fit unto the purpose of pleasing him. It doesn't matter if the master in these parables is going off to a distant land to receive a kingdom. It doesn't matter if the owner of a vineyard is being described. It doesn't matter if it's a person who has a vineyard and he put some tenants in there. It doesn't matter if he's having people working the vineyard. The stories are all the same. And they all operate off the idea of him having given you something and then him coming back and asking the question, what did you do with what I gave you? What did you do with what he's given you? You know, that is a really good thing to ask yourself. What have I done with the gifts that Jesus has given me? Boy, do we get distracted on that. We've got a certain set of gifts, and then we look at what someone else is doing and ask, what have they done, and then how have I done relative to them? Does that ever happen in one of Jesus' parables? Hey, I compared you to the guy who had 2 talents. You've done really well. You win. No. He never seems to care about any of the other folks. He just says, I know what I gave you, and I want to know what you did. I remember I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and back when I was growing up there, they had what they call it, the Boulder Classic, anyhow, a big bicycle race. And it was, at the time, actually one of the bigger bicycle races in the United States. And one of the things that they did was they went around this park in North Boulder. And I didn't happen to go to this particular race, but sometimes go and watch it as a family, but my brother did, and he told me about it afterwards. But it's one of those, I don't know what they call it, criterion race or something like that, but They go around the park, which is like a 3-mile trip, but they must go around it like 20 times or something like that. And the interesting thing with a bike race is the big trick about bike racing is to get someone in front of you to break the wind so you can follow along behind them, and then you're doing a lot less work than the person who's breaking the wind. And then the way you win a bike race is kind of break out in front. Usually a cluster of people kind of break out in front, and they pull away from the other guys, and so they can't catch you because you have to break wind to catch them because they've separated themselves from you. And that's kind of how you win, you win your bike race. Well, so they had one of these little breakouts. They go out to the front, and this one guy is just he's chugging along, and the breakout group is behind him, and next thing you know, he's breaking out in front of the breakout group. And everyone's saying, yeah, just wait for a few laps. He'll be coming back to reality. But he didn't. He kept pedaling. And before long, he's like halfway around the park in front of everybody else. And then he just keeps pedaling. And then he's 2/3 of the way around. And then he caught the back of the rest of the pack. I'm not even moving since he's talking to me. This is a really bad sign. So he caught the rest of the pack from behind. And you know what that means in a bike race? That means all these clowns are going to be breaking wind for you the whole rest of the time. And you don't have to pay any dues because you'll cross the finish line and you'll be done. They'll have another whole lap to go, right? This dude can just he can just surf on home. And you know what he did? He started working his way up through that pack. And he got to the front of the pack, and then he broke out in front of him again. Because he said, I don't care how fast you go. I'm going to race my best. Wow. Had a similar experience, interestingly different, with a friend of mine, and I went to this bike race. One of my good friends was amateur bike racer, but they had a bike race. This is up in Fort Collins, where I went to college. And he was in the front of this pack, similar kind of thing where they're doing a whole bunch of laps. He's in the front in with the front pack, and about 80% of the way through the race, he can't keep up anymore. And he fades out of that front pack. He comes back to kind of the main cluster. But the problem is once you've done that, you realize you cannot win the race because you're not in the place from which the winner will come, so to speak. You're with the pack. And he goes around a couple times with the pack, and then he just quits. He pulls over, we sit down beside I sit down beside him and watch the rest of the race and chatting with him afterwards. He says, well, how'd you feel about it? You did pretty good. And he's like, I feel terrible. I go, why is that? He says, did you see the guy who just crossed the finish line? And I go, yeah. He said, do you understand what just happened? I go, no. He crossed the finish line. And I quit as soon as I knew I couldn't win. Oh. And again, what is he doing in the opposite direction? Saying, I will judge my service in comparison to others. Rather than to say whether I'm fast or whether I'm slow, I am what I am, and I will finish with full zeal. Everything that God has given me will be left on the field. Whether I finish first by a lap and a half or last by 40 laps, it doesn't matter because I'm going to leave it on the course. What a great picture. Jesus is our judge. It doesn't matter what anybody else is doing. We serve him. He gifted us. He entrusted those things to us. And he's coming back to ask us what we did with what he gave us, not with what he gave your neighbor. He's our judge because he's our master. The other thing that master, one of the other overtones of master is that of person who is to be worshiped. Lord in that sense. And you see that, you pick that up in the sheep and the goats parable where the people at the end, they're saying, Lord, Lord, when did we ever see you, and fill in the blank. But the context of Jesus sitting on the great white throne. Thomas, when he finally puts his hand in Jesus' side, says, my Lord and my God. That's sort of an ash of, this is a person to whom my worship is due. And that's hopefully obvious. Hopefully that's relatively pleasant to you. I just wanted to throw that out as a quick reminder, because this one probably is nice enough for us to do, but really easy to forget at times like this, right? Because there's so many other things to worry about. And let me just remind you, the worship of Jesus is one of your first things. It goes in the bucket first. Don't blow off your times with Jesus. Don't blow off your times in chapel. Don't blow off your times in church. Don't blow off your times of worship, because he's still your master. Now, these are some of the things that, as I mentioned, you would probably somewhat expect of a master, that he's your commander, that he's your judge, that he should be your object of worship, your person of worship. Some other things are less expected that you find of Jesus. One of the other things that he is for us is our model. This passage that I just introduced this with, you call me Lord and Master, and so I am. What's that from? John 13, where he washes the disciples' feet. And the interesting thing is, this guy I've been talking about, his master, becomes the model of a slave in the exact passage where he reminds us that he's a master. And when he calls us to be a servant, he is not asking us to do something that he himself has not done. He knows what it is to empty himself, become born as a human being, and being found in human form, to humble himself and to become a servant. He's done that too. He's not asking you to do something that he himself did not do. He's also not asking you to make sacrifice when he wouldn't make sacrifice himself. It's ironic and interesting that we even talk about the Lord's table, the Lord's cup, all of this language. That should hit us as really the Lord's sacrifice. All this language we have with communion, do you realize what you're saying when you say that? The Lord sacrificed. That's like the general's bayonet charge or the president's dish towel. The president, the general, they just don't do the bayonet charge or the dish towel, right? That's paradoxical. And that the Lord has a cup of sacrifice, that the Lord has a table of sacrifice, of ultimate sacrifice. That should be jarring to us every time we hear it. And yet it becomes kind of second nature to us, because it just seems like, well, of course. We hear it, we think it all the time. Another kind of final point on this, Jesus also calls himself friend. And interestingly enough, for all the comments that I said before about him often not explaining, and I would point out he often does not explain exactly why he does what he does. I think of Kate's story and some of the questions. I'm sure she probably asked, why, Lord? May not have ever really gotten that question well answered. He doesn't always answer, but one of the other things he says is, I'm your friend, and one of the characteristics of the friend is that he knows what the master is doing, what the father is doing. He is not the person who is keeping you in the dark. And he includes us relationally with him, not simply as a master, but he also includes us as a friend. And if that seems kind of crazy and paradoxical, then you've gotten it. Because that really is what Jesus is saying. I know it seems crazy, but I am to you both master and friend. So that's the Jesus whom we serve, whom we honor as master. And if you're anxious about the idea of letting him be your master because you're worried about what that means, let me just part with one simple, easy thing to help you remember putting this into action. Here's the way the mastery of Jesus works. The price of admission, so to speak, is that you take up your cross and follow him, right? The blessing of that is that you lay down your burdens. And that is Christian discipleship, right? You take up your cross so as to lay down your burdens. And there are 10 million burdens, usually that come from 10 million places. But there's one thing that's really needful, and that is that we take up our cross and that we follow him. And I think when we do that, all those other burdens tend to find their way into the proper places in and around those great big rocks that we put in the bucket of our life first. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we do pray for this time of year, for all of us, for the many things that seem to be crowding for our attention and how easy it is to let those things become our masters. And Lord, it is our prayer that as we leave here tonight, we would leave with a renewed commitment to let you be our master, to take up our cross and follow you, and at the same time take up your burdens and discover that they are indeed easy, light, and blessings. So we ask this grace from you now to make us your servants, your slaves, that we might honor you as master and as Lord. And we pray this in your name. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.